The 1919 Revolution of Egypt. Egypt has undergone many revolutions, including the Revolution of 1919. Before discussing this revolution, it is important to look at all that took place prior. In the 19th century, Muhammad Ali reigned over Egypt. In his quest to emulate and become one with the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain, he created the colonization of Egypt, known as the self-colonizing colonized. In the process, he also controlled Sudan and did so for over 6 decades. In 1882, Britain began occupying Egypt as well as many other Middle Eastern countries. Ali's grandson, Ishmael, took up the role as Khedive and attempted to continue expansion in Sudan as well as make Egypt an independent nation. He wanted to control the Suez Canal and build new infrastructure in Egypt. He borrowed heavily on unfavorable terms from British, French, and German banks. By 1876, the Khedive had become so financially desperate that he was forced to sell 44% of Egypt's Suez Canal shares to the British government. Thus, by 1876, direct European control of Egyptian finances had begun. He also placed British officials in administration, and in the end, he was disposed of in 1879 and replaced by his son Tawfiq. Many years later, World War I began, and Britain used Egypt as a protectorate. Egypt became the greatest British military base outside of Britain and France. While Egypt had less casualties throughout the war, they were robbed of their independence still, as they were used by England, France, and Germany. Despite the war ending, the presence of British soldiers and rule did not cease. Egypt's source of income was cotton, yet with the control of Great Britain over them, many countries that typically purchased from Egypt through the trade were enemies that Britain banned the sale of cotton to. Britain knew that if they did not find a way to make up for the loss in revenue, the Egyptians would revolt. In an open letter to the British financial advisor, Edward Cecil, he accused the British of safeguarding their own financial interests and securing the financial stability of the Egyptian government at the expense of Egyptian cultivators. Post-war inflation also hurt Egypt as well, which caused many Egyptians, mostly farmers, to revolt. Egyptian nationalists began making demands in order to have Egyptians controlling more of the country and less British influence. Once Hussein Kamil died and his half-brother, Prince Ahmad Fuad, took his place as Sultan, he appointed some Egyptian nationalists to his party to replace the pro-British ones. Zaghloul and Fahmeh, the leaders of the Nationalist Party, attempted to come to London in order to discuss their demands, but they were denied the opportunity, and Zaghloul assumed this to be due to the uninterest in Egypt by the leaders of Great Britain. Eventually, he was exiled to Malta, along with a few others from the Nationalist Party. Martial law was also enacted, and this sparked the beginning of the revolution. Protests and riots began. By March 15th, things had gotten so bad that British leaders were begging for the Wafd to be heard in Britain, but they were too denied. The protests were for the release and return of the Wafd, the independence of Egypt, the retreat of British presence, and for Egypt to actually control itself. Changes in power were made, and Zaghloul was released from his banishment, but later sent back for refusing to give up hostile political activity. During the protest for change and for the release of Zaghloul and his party, students of universities and even women joined the protests. Women in Egypt had become more as feminist as well as nationalist, believing in Egypt for Egyptians. Through journalism, female Egyptian scholars were able to bring increase to nationalistic consciousness and feminism together. During the 1919 revolution, Huda Shawari led veiled women demonstrators in the struggle against the British. Female solidarity with the Egyptian nationalists was exemplified by Shawari's close collaboration with Saad Zaghloul. It was at the forefront of the push for independence from Britain, with both men and women lending their support to the party of the nation. Safiya Zaghloul also helped push the demand for freedom, becoming the national mother figure by signing petitions and holding meetings to discuss future plans for ensuring Egypt's freedom. There were demonstrations that took place, both peaceful and violent, that seemed to bring Egyptians from all walks of life together. Most historians agree that the 1919 revolution was a spontaneous uprising ignited by the circumstances of World War I and by the refusal of the British to negotiate directly with the Egyptians in the post-war conferences. The Wafd met with Sir Reginald Wingate in order to discuss plans of reinstating Egypt's autonomy. The British government sought to keep Egypt as a protectorate and dismissed the ideas brought forth by Zalul. When the Wafd began demanding the opportunity to discuss their freedom in Versailles, they were banished to Marta. This sparked demonstrations to which the British responded with violence. On March 12th, the British fired on 3,000 demonstrators in Tanta, killing 11 and wounding 52. Another 13 were killed at the Mosque of Al-Sayyida Zainab in Cairo. On March 14th, British military personnel were being attacked and killed. By March 16th, 3,000 Egyptians were dead. The entire country rebelled against Britain, and General Allenby was left with no choice but to allow Zalul to be released and attend the peace conference. The result was that Egypt remained a protectorate, and revolts continued in Egypt. Because of the overwhelming support of the people, with Zalul being who they wanted to lead and represent Egypt, this interfered with who the British wanted to be in power. For this, Zalul was exiled again on February 20th of 1922. This did not last long, as on February 28th, Great Britain decided to recognize Egypt as being independent. On March 15th, Egypt was considered an independent state. Although free, there were still issues that continued among the British and Egyptian government, but they had finally come to an agreement. With what happened in Egypt's quest to be independent, I sense that both Tilly and Fannin's words describe the revolution best. The native is declared insensible to ethics. He represents not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, let us dare to admit, the enemy of values, and in this sense, he is the absolute evil. He is the corrosive element, destroying all that comes near him. Based on these words, it is made clear by looking into Egypt's history, including slavery, kidnapping, and forced prostitution, that Britain thought of Egypt as evil and unknowing of real ethics. They took it upon themselves to use the war to gain control over Egypt without caring about anything but their own benefit against the Ottoman Empire. Tilly then speaks of the us-them dynamic, which was clearly emphasized in 1919 when the revolts began. It was the people of Egypt against Great Britain. As Tilly states, claims to be or represent a certain we always identify a boundary separating us from them, whoever they are. Boundary activation ignites violence, and both the British and the people of Egypt made their boundaries clear. The British, by ignoring the demands of the people and the Wafd that represented them, and sparking riots. Also by the Egyptians, by protesting against British presence. The violence that ensued came from the British killing peaceful protesters, and this resulted in a violent reaction where the people began harming and killing British soldiers. It does make one wonder if violence can in fact create the change that is demanded of the people.